So Forbes just published its annual list of billionaires, its world billionaires list. And ever since reading it, there's been a couple of things I can't stop thinking about. Because as it relates to here, as it relates to Russia, Russia has now 155 billionaires on that list. And that's more than it's ever been. It's an all-time high. And their combined wealth is around $700 billion. And both of those figures are actually a record. And it's been going up and been going up for the last 4 years. And of course, everyone knows the last 4 years in Russia have been dominated by the war with Ukraine. So it's a whole period which has had all these sanctions, lots of restrictions, lots of capital focused on the front. But still, there are more billionaires and the combined wealth keeps going up. And it's been like that for year and year and year. Now, I find that pretty interesting because that might go against what a lot of, let's say, international perceptions might be, or what presumptions might have been when the war started. So the question is, how? In a country under, more international sanctions than anyone has ever seen before, how? It's a country fighting a very expensive war. It has an economy that's been stagnating for, let's say, 2 of the last 4 years. I think the first 2 years after the war started were okay, but in the last, let's say, since the end of 2024, start of 2025, the economy's been struggling. But still, the billionaire class is getting bigger and it's getting richer when so many ordinary people are struggling with this huge inflation. So in this video, I want to touch on how that's happened, what role sanctions have had to play on that, what role the international community has had to play on enriching so many of the richest Russian people even more, while so many ordinary people suffer. So let's talk about it in this video. And of course, today's video comes to you from just near Red Square, just right by the Moscow River over there, as I go for a little walk and talk to you about the Russian economy. So to understand why this latest Forbes list is surprising, then you have to look back to what people thought in February and March 2022, just as Putin launched the war on Ukraine, the invasion. All these Western countries, so that's the European Union, that's the USA, and of course my home country, the UK, launched a barrage of sanctions against Russia. And one of the explicit aims of these sanctions was to hurt the elites, to hurt the oligarchs, as they call them in Russia, with the idea that you put pressure on the richest people, you seize their yachts, you take away their properties in France and Italy, you ground their private jets, you freeze their bank accounts in Zurich or Cyprus, then their lives will be hurt, their lives will be harmed, and they'll turn straight to Putin. They'll get on the phone, they'll get on the blower and say, Vladimir Vladimirovich, please stop the war. You're hurting me, you're hurting my family, you're hurting our friends. Now, in the first few weeks after the war started, maybe some people thought that would work. Yachts were seized, houses were seized, and a couple of oligarchs made sort of, I don't want to say they called for peace, but they sort of made some noises, let's say, but it wasn't really very strong, even if the headlines were just full of Italian ports seeing yachts being seized. So the expectation at that time was, well, in many quarters, was that the billionaire class in Russia would be significantly weakened. Some of them might even defect to the West, that the combination of asset freezes and reputational pressure would, at minimum, stop the concentration of wealth at the top. And now, of course, 4 years later, these figures published by Forbes show a very, very different story. If the goal was to stop these rich people keeping all their money, then that has dramatically failed. So I'm just reading from my phone. In 2022, at the start of the full-scale invasion, there were 88 Russian billionaires on the Forbes list. It rose in 2023, it rose in 2024, in 2025, and now in 2026 there's 155. Each year, more and more, each year getting richer. The combined wealth figure, as I mentioned before, and that's the one that I think is perhaps more important than the actual numbers of people themselves, but the actual amount of money that they control altogether, 695 billion. For context, that's more than the total bank savings of the entire rest of the Russian population. So my notes say here that every deposit held by every ordinary Russian citizen in every Russian bank amounts to roughly 587 billion. That's versus 695 billion. So that's $100 billion difference. So if you wanted to know anything about the magnitude of it all, I guess that says everything. Now, before I get into the why, I think it makes sense to touch a little bit on the who. Because Russian billionaires is not just one homogeneous block. These 155 people are not all the same. They have very different stories. They're from very different industries. And the war has affected them all, but in remarkably different ways. So, for example, to mention a big loser on the list, the most obvious one is Pavel Durov, who's the owner of Telegram, the messaging app everyone uses here in Russia. He saw his net worth absolutely collapse from 17 billion to 6 or 7 billion in just 1 year. And the reason for that is basically the mounting restrictions on Telegram here in Russia, which has seriously damaged its long-term commercial prospects. And Russia is one of the biggest markets for Telegram. There's also Arkady Volozh, who's the founder of Yandex, which is basically Russia's version of Google, who has actually renounced his Russian citizenship entirely, but he's dropped off the list. So even if he had a Russian passport, he still wouldn't be on the list anymore. There were 8 other Russians who were on the list in 2025 and fell off in 2026, and that's either because their fortunes slipped below the threshold of $1 billion, or very often it's actually that happened because they lost key assets that they once owned. But so I think it's fair to say it's not every Russian billionaire that has sailed through 2025 unscathed to be on the list in 2026. Some were significantly diminished by exactly the dynamics you'd expect: loss of Western market access, sanctions cutting off international finance, and choosing to exit Russia rather than operate in the country under the Kremlin's terms. But the overall count still grew because of gains elsewhere. So it's worth me now identifying the distinct groups where those gains over the past year have happened, where these new billionaires are coming from. Well, the first group is actually not new billionaires, but billionaires that have massively increased their wealth, and that's the old classic oligarchs. That's steel, nickel, oil, gas billionaires whose fortunes date back to the privatizations of the 1990s. For example, Alexei Mordashov, the steel magnate who now tops the Russian list with $37 billion. That's up 8 billion in a single year. There's also Vladimir Potanin of Norilsk Nickel, who's at 29.7 billion. And these are people whose core assets, Russian industrial infrastructure, were never really dependent on Western markets, so they've been able to continue without much disruption. And their wealth is also denominated mainly in rubles. It's tied to Russian commodities, and effectively it's captive to the domestic economy rather than the international economy. So that basically means that sanctions couldn't easily reach those businesses. The second group of billionaires is the politically connected insiders who have capitalized on the exit of Western companies from Russia. So when hundreds of Western companies left Russia in 2022, 2023, their Russian operations had to be sold quickly, under pressure, at prices way below the value. And the buyers were always people that had the approval of the Kremlin to buy those businesses with the Kremlin's approval, with domestic capital, and with the appetite to operate in the current sanctions environment. So that's a very narrow and specific group, already well connected, already well capitalized, using a crisis moment to acquire assets at a discount that they otherwise couldn't easily have afforded. And there's a third group, which I would say are really the big winners now in the last 12 months, and that's the winners in new sectors. And that's where this story gets more interesting for me. So 7 out of the 14 people joining the Forbes list this year made their money in agriculture and food. So that's not oil, that's not metals, this is agriculture and food. It's not an industry where you typically find lots of billionaires. So that's grain, vegetable oils, meat, food processing. It's a billionaire class in Russia that barely existed a decade ago, and the war has built a new billionaire class. So that's the 3 different groups. It's the old oligarchs, it's the politically connected, already wealthy people who managed to buy Western businesses that were leaving at a huge discount, and then there's the new sectors like agriculture that have just come out of nowhere to be huge Russian businesses. So now I want to get into the mechanics exactly, because understanding why these Russians have gotten richer requires an understanding of a few distinct things that have been happening simultaneously in Russia over the past year. And the first is what you could call a locked door. So before 2022, wealthy Russians had built an elaborate global financial infrastructure over the last 30 years, basically since the 90s. They had offshore holding companies in Cyprus and the British Virgin Islands. They had properties in London and the south of France. They had bank accounts in Switzerland. And this infrastructure provided Russian oligarchs, it served multiple purposes. But one of those purposes was that significant portions of oligarch wealth was outside of Russia, which gave them optionality. If things turned difficult at home, if shit hit the fan, they had money outside the country, they could leave and they'd be fine. So one of the things that's changed since the start of the war is that sanctions have closed that option, and almost overnight the Western financial system that Russian capital has always depended on became inaccessible for Russians. So accounts have been frozen, properties have been seized or just been locked in like really long legal proceedings, and the routes to move capital in and out of the country, well, a lot of the mainstream ones have been cut off because of sanctions regimes. So the result of that is that capital, which actually might have left Russia, which might have given many billionaires some leverage to distance themselves away from the Kremlin or other people in power here in Russia, had nowhere to go but keep all of their assets inside the country. And stuck capital in an economy that the state controls very tightly gets deployed in ways that reinforce the existing power structure that exists now in Russia. So this can be described very plainly as you can basically just say that the sanctions made it essentially impossible for oligarchs to leave Russia even if they wanted to. And in practice, these sanctions have helped Putin mobilize the assets of these oligarchs in support of the war economy. And we could argue whether there could be better designed Western sanctions that could have avoided that outcome, basically forcing this outcome, which goes against the whole idea of Western sanctions, what they wanted to achieve. But the outcome is what it is, and we've seen that a lot over the past few years, and that's why the rich are just getting richer. The second mechanism that has helped Russian billionaires get richer away from sanctions is actually the war economy itself. And that's probably maybe the most underreported part of this story, because wars generate enormous state spending, and Russia is currently spending somewhere above 6% of its GDP each year on defense, which is the highest since the fall of the Soviet Union. And that money has to go somewhere. Where is it going? It's going to defense contractors, it's going to weapons manufacturers, it's going to ammunition producers, military logistics companies, construction firms building fortifications and other military infrastructure, and of course the technology companies that are developing things like drones and electronic warfare systems that have become so advanced in the last few years. Some of that then is going to state-owned enterprises, but a significant share of this war economy money is going to privately held companies whose owners are, or will become in the next few years, the kind of people who appear on lists like Forbes. Because defense adjacent business in wartime Russia is not like lots of the other businesses have been in Russia over the decades. It's not slow or bureaucratic, which has held back business for so long. Because there's urgency, there's state money, and there's political protection for anyone delivering what the Kremlin needs. Beyond direct defense, there's a wider circle of war economy winners, which are not weapons producers, and that's things like people providing for import substitution, so essentially people who make inside Russia now what used to come from the West. So it's people who have filled those gaps. That's called import substitution. That's created genuine business opportunities for many domestically orientated manufacturers, and state procurement has expanded that massively. As a result, the logistics sector has boomed. The companies that handle the rerouting of Russian trade away from Western routes towards Asia, the Middle East and Africa, they're doing very, very well. Construction has surged. That's tied partly to military spending and partly to infrastructure projects as the Kremlin deploys its money as political signals. And then, as I've mentioned, one of the big winners is agriculture. This deserves its own video, really. Russia has dramatically expanded its food export footprint since 2022. It's now one of the world's largest exporters of wheat, and its grain, its vegetable oils and its food products have found eager buyers all over the global south. These are markets that are perhaps indifferent to the war or just actively interested in deepening their ties with Moscow. So the 7 new agricultural billionaires on the Forbes list aren't there by coincidence. They're a structural consequence of Russia's reorientating of its entire trade architecture since the start of the war, since sanctions. Now, there is a third mechanism outside of the two I've just mentioned that explain why Russian billionaires have gotten richer in the last year. And this is, it's quite a simple concept, but I don't know how well I'm going to be able to explain it, but I'm going to try my best. So Russia has been running super high inflation for 2 years now, a little bit longer actually. So the central bank has had its key rate, the main inflation rate here in Russia. For the whole of 2025, it was around 21%. It's actually now come down to 15.5%, but for the 12 months that this Forbes list was created for, it was around 21% for that time. And that's obviously very, very high. 21% interest is massive. And it was deployed by the central bank to try and contain price rises running above their target of 10% annually. And here's what high inflation actually does to asset prices. It pushes them up in nominal terms, even when the underlying economy isn't growing. So I'll give you an example. If you own a factory, or you own a piece of agricultural land, or a block of commercial real estate, in a high inflation environment like we've been living here in Russia, the ruble value of that asset tends to rise simply because money is worth less. So the business itself might not be more productive. The economy might not be healthier, but the number on the balance sheet goes up because rubles themselves are worth less. Now, times that with the currency effect. Forbes calculates wealth in US dollars. And over the past year, the ruble has massively strengthened against the US dollar. I believe it's something like 15-16%. So a Russian billionaire whose ruble value, let's say all their money stayed exactly the same. They didn't make a single ruble in 1 year. It stayed exactly the same. According to Forbes now, because it's converted into dollars, they're 15% richer than they were the year before. So they appear wealthier in dollar terms just from a currency move. So it's not evidence of economic health. This is just a mechanical effect. And when you put these two things together, so domestic inflation pushes up nominal asset values, and then the ruble appreciates, boosting the value of these assets in dollars just because of the conversion, then you get a meaningful portion of this headline wealth increase, these billionaires making more and more money due to actual measurement conditions rather than productivity, rather than anyone actually building something new. So that doesn't make this wealth not real or make it illusory, because, I mean, this money does buy things. It buys things inside Russia. But that $695 billion is more complicated than it appears when you consider that it's not because people are more productive exactly, and it's not exactly because the economy is doing so great. It's because of these two structural differences which have added on top to all the other benefits I've mentioned throughout this video. So, Russia has 155 billionaires now. It's a record for 4 years in a row. $695 billion in combined wealth. But what does this actually mean? It means several distinct things are happening at once. Some people got richer because Russian industrial assets were always isolated from Western pressure, and the war didn't change that. Some got richer because the exit of Western companies created a buyer's market, and they had the capital and, more importantly, the Kremlin connections to take advantage. And some are genuinely new to the list because of the war economy. Defense spending, agriculture, import substitution. This has all created wealth in sectors that did not exist before. And like I mentioned at the end, some of this increase is just a valuation effect. It's inflation and a stronger ruble making ruble-denominated assets look bigger when they're converted into dollars. And of course, some people got poorer too. I mentioned Durov, I mentioned Valosh. There's 8 other people who dropped off the list entirely. So the story here isn't that every billionaire sailed through unscathed. Here we see 2 tech billionaires that have suffered. But what this story is, I think, and this is the part I've kept coming back to since I first read the new billionaires list, is that the costs of the war and the consequence of sanctions have not landed where so many people expected they would. The billionaire class as a whole has expanded, not contracted. The pain has landed elsewhere, basically, away from the rich. It's landed on ordinary Russians who are facing higher taxes, 20% mortgage rates, prices rising faster than wages. The cost has gone on to the National Wealth Fund that's been drawn down to cover the deficit, and it's come down on the civilian economy, which has been crowded out to make room for military spending. Now, I don't want to make this to sound like an argument that these sanctions were wrong, or they were right, or anything like that, really. It's not really a valued judgment. I'm not a sanctions expert, and I certainly don't want to give my own political opinion. But you can say that the effect that they've had is real, and there is a real structural strain, and the effect on the economy here is compounding, but the distribution of that strain has not been even, and I cannot imagine that this is the way that the people who drew up these Western sanctions against Russia wanted them to be. Surely they didn't want it that the richest got richer and the poorest got poorer. And anyway, this Forbes list is one imperfect way of seeing that.